So hello everyone. As already said, my name is Sven Torben, and today I want to talk about domain depth. And I assume most of you are working in some kind of technical role in IT. Is that correct so far? Okay. So maybe all of you have already heard about technical depth. And whom of you have ever heard about the term domain depth? Okay, no one. So better I talk about technical depth then first. So when asked what technical depth is, answers generally vary a lot. Some people say it's just a postponement for non-execution of certain tasks, like people just not documenting, or the documentation isn't up to date, or code that hasn't just been tested and is deferred to some later kind of project phase. And yeah, but sometimes people just say it's just poor programming style or missing coding standards, anti-patterns that are used, and such stuff. But in general, there's a very common point in all definitions that we can see, and that is that technical depth primarily acts as an expense driver. So software that contains technical depth is generally harder to write and also to maintain. And so basically it takes longer to write code and to maintain code when there's a lot of technical depth. So since it takes longer, it's more cost intense. And the longer technical depth persists, it even gets more cost intense to just remove that technical depth. And at some point, I think that in the software industry, we seem to get used to that kind of depth. So everyone talks about it, we try to fight it, but somehow we cannot avoid it. And I'm not judging this in some kind of way, it's just some kind of fact, I believe. And so what we rarely never discuss is some kind of business-driven depth. We always talk about technical aspects in some kind, but we never call or look at the business aspect of this, and that's what I call domain depth. So, and I believe it all starts with some kind of misunderstanding. Alberto once said it's developers' misunderstanding, not expert knowledge that gets released in production. So if this is true, and I do believe it is, I claim that developers must become domain experts. We had the talk of Cyril, I think, who was talking about raising the waterline, and I think that's exactly what I want to say. So we need to raise that line so that all developers can become some kind of domain expert. But what do we do if developers are not such experts yet? So what if developers are in some kind of learning process? They're becoming experts. What if they are trying to raise that waterline? I believe that developers are making failures because we're people and people do make failures. And failure is vital to learning. So let me give you an example. I'm currently working on a large-scale project with teams who are re-implementing a software system for a railway company. Oh, thanks. So there are hundreds of developers, several teams, and so when you're working for a railway company, you basically talk about trains and train runs. And there are all kinds of different kinds of models. For example, you have train runs which consist just of a bunch of stops, where stops is an arrival and departure and station, and I think that's understandable in some kind of way. And such a model is, for example, very a good fit, so to say, when you, for example, trying to calculate whether you can reach another train, like a connecting train, and you need to know how much time you have at a certain stop to go from one platform to the other. But when you're, for example, talking about seat reservations, that doesn't make much sense, because what you need is like the origin where you want to enter the train and the destination where you want to leave, and there may be several stops in between, so you're actually more talking about whole sections or segments. But at some point, these models seem to be interchangeable. So for example, you could also derive a bunch of stops from a set of sections. And, I'm sorry. So at this point, we had a team which was really struggling with this. And we couldn't figure out why. So at some point, we started to do some kind of code analysis to understand why change was so inefficient. And we used some techniques that Adam already talked about in the morning. And maybe I just show you an example. So we found a few hotspots, and one was a very, very, very tiny thing. So there was, at some point, there was a method introduced for a delta calculation, so that is used whenever you add stops to the schedule, for example. And all of this was based on sections. So you can see there were sections added, have been calculated, and the delta was added based on the old train run and the new train run and the sections and so on. And we looked at the change history of this code, and at some point, there was a very tiny change. They just changed the wording of a variable from sections to stops. And that was where we actually looked at the model in much more detail. And then there was another change where they introduced this calculate stops from sections method. So the whole model was basically spoiled with all of these transformations. So at this point, we became very clear that the core domain model wasn't somewhat incorrect or had the wrong abstractions for the problem at hand. And then we talked to the user experience experts and the other domain experts at hand, and they all said, oh, okay, it's clear, you have to do that on stops and not on sections. But nobody basically told them. So as a result, there was some kind of rework and refactorings and all that stuff. Yeah, maybe that's a very, very small example. But you can find other examples like that. And if you have a bunch of examples in a large-scale project, that may really be a cost-intensive thing to refactor all of the code and always check whether there are such flaws, for example. So now all of this refactoring takes time, it takes effort, and in the end, money. So let me raise a question. Isn't that an expense driver? And isn't it debt in that sense? But is this technical debt? So the whole code base was very clean. It was well tested and followed many very software design principles. But this model was fundamentally wrong. So now, is this technical debt? I don't know, maybe you say yes. But I would say no, it isn't. And here's why. When facing technical debt, the general approach I see is that you write some kind of user story, put that into your backlog, hopefully get some time, and then you try to fix that. So a programmer and a software architect maybe, and they just refactor code. But that doesn't work for that kind of problem we are facing here. I mean, it's very familiar for most of us, but in the end, preventing and reducing this technical debt, as I call it, must be an interdisciplinary team approach. And it cannot be achieved only through technical measures. You cannot just sit down with a bunch of developers and architects and just try to refactor code based on some kind of user story or some kind of technical finding in code. That doesn't work. And especially preventing this kind of debt takes some upfront understanding of your problem space. Now, we were working in an iterative model, basically Scrum or whatever in general these days. But I believe that there must be some kind of, I don't want to call that a phase, but some kind of knowledge crunching and stuff very early so you can prevent these kind of failure. And since we as the DDD community are very considerate about language, I'm wondering why we don't have a term for that. And that's why I call that thing domain debt. I believe it's time to coin such a term so we get more attention to this kind of problem from management, and that we get the time and all the people together to fix this kind of issues in our code bases. That's all I want to say for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions?
So is it about the following of ubiquitous language?
So the question was, is that about following the ubiquitous language?
So look back at the example. I think that's a ubiquitous language. Everyone is talking about these terms, but they do have a different meaning in different contexts. And even domain experts in this kind of context are always switching these kind of contexts. They are talking about these people about it and with other people about nearly the same things. And they use the same terms. And you don't know sometimes when they are changing context. And this, from my perspective, needs much more knowledge crunching upfront than you can just do this in an iterative kind of way all the time. Because once such things manifest in code, you're basically lost. Then that's where you get that kind of debt and you need to invest more time and money to fix it.
Hi, I've been in this situation many times actually, and I've never found a solution to it because it's a case of no one has come up with that knowledge.
Yeah.
Everyone was given the opportunity, but for whatever circumstances that came up, you know, it never came out that there was this fundamental piece of information that was missing from whether it's the core domain model or any aspect. You know, you've gone through all of the testing, you've put the system in front of people, and they've not found it. So, isn't it just a case of just suck it up and say, well, this is just, you know, this is just part of life?
Yeah, maybe. But for me, it's just some kind of just giving up. I mean, we need to go into that kind of process. Because if we think about being more outcome-orientated kind of software development project, for example, we need to talk to our customers. We need to get much more closer to that business. It doesn't work if you just, there's a business analyst who's talking to a customer, and then maybe there's a project manager. So it's like 10,000 steps before this kind of knowledge comes to the developer. And for me, that doesn't work. So we need to change something at that point. And the point I want to make here with this, we need to should coin some term for this, so we get more attention than just talking about technical debt at that point, because it's like a burned phrase for me. So no one listens to this detail anymore.
Do you believe there's a relationship between technical and domain debt?
Depends on what you really understand on technical. So I think we use these words interchangeably sometimes. But when I talk about technical debt, I'm more thinking about refactorings in terms of things that are coming from our frameworks, from technology in general. And I think it's a different thing than domain debt. This arises from misunderstandings of our problem space and the solution we built from it. And technical debt is more coming from a technical perspective, like maybe our architecture or frameworks we use and such stuff.
I also have a question. Isn't that something that we call refactoring towards deep insight?
Yeah.
And supple design?
In some way.
And another thing is that I don't think domain itself has a debt, because domain
It's
exists.
the understanding about the domain
Yes,
that
it's
introduces some kind of debt, yeah.
Maybe I want to convince you to change it like to modeling debt.
Modeling debt.
Because that's the model that's wrong. The
Yep.
domain is right.
Yeah.
Domain is always right.
Domain is always right.
Yeah.
That's like, yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.